it is a particular honor to address you from so far away. To redeem such an honor has meant many of my days have been occupied thinking about what I might say, and as a consequence, many of my nights have been both dreamless and sleepless. I am told that in a 20-minute long TED Talk, you are advised to talk about one matter only. If that be so, I warn you that this is no TED Talk. In fact, I wanted you to know ahead of time that I worry that I am trying to cover too much ground in the time you have made available to me. For that reason, I have requested the conference organizers email you a copy of this address to read at your convenience. I hope this will allow you to relax and just take in what is comfortable for you. First, I wanted to tell you two stories to set the scene for what follows. I cherish a memory of a revelation I had when I was 17 years old. I remember it so keenly that when I do, it seems I am reliving it. My final secondary school examinations were just around the corner. I had never studied quite so diligently before. Which university you were eligible for depended on your marks. I'm sure that had a lot to do with it. I had taken French for 5 years and Latin for 4 years in secondary school. I took considerable pleasure translating either of them into English. I found it beguiling. I recall a momentous occasion translating a short story when I found myself shouting aloud, "You have a French mind, you have a French mind." There was no one I could confide this in whom I thought might understand what I could possibly have meant by this. I worried that my parents would have been concerned for my mental status going around shouting aloud. And it only dawned on me some time later what it meant and the significance of what had been revealed to me. Only a few weeks later, while translating Julius Caesar from Latin into English, I had a similar revelation and once again believed myself to have a Latin mind as well. I now consider myself to be in possession of 3 minds, but wisely again I kept this to myself. But from then on I believed that languages, each of which was of course a culture encoded in words, had a mind of its own. One of my life regrets is that I was never able to become truly bilingual. It was only as a traveling companion on an intellectual and political journey my colleague and friend Marcela Polenko took translating Michael's maps of narrative practice into her Colombian Spanish that I've been able to somewhat alleviate this regret. I will have more to say about this later. Here is another tale at variance to the above. At a recent social occasion, I was introduced to the niece of a friend who had just returned from the United States, where she had attended Hamburger University, where she completed a bachelor degree in hamburgerology. Don't laugh. There is a Hamburger University offering degrees in hamburgerology. I am told that Hamburger University was established in 1961 and is located at Oak Brook, Illinois, near Chicago by McDonald's to instruct their employees in the various aspects of restaurant management. To date, it has graduated more than 80,000 students. 7,500 students attend each year. It has the capacity to teach in 28 languages and now has campuses all around the world. I was intrigued, as I suspect you would have been, to learn of their pedagogy. For example, what did they teach and how was it assessed? She told me that, what I suppose is the equivalent of a dissertation, was the following. She had to provide instruction to would-be employees on how to make a Macburger, so that a Shanghai Macburger was absolutely identical to one made in New York. A Macburger in Mumbai was absolutely identical to one made in Berlin. And if she faltered or had not memorized her script word for word, she would have failed. I'm glad to report she passed with flying colors and now has a McDonald's franchise here in New Zealand. To my way of thinking, these are the two extremes of what I am going to call translation in the widest sense of the word. One which currently goes by the term global, and the other which goes by the narrative therapy concern for the local in particular. Let me tell you how I began this journey with Marcela Polenko. I had organized a conference in Havana, Cuba in 2007 with the help of others after I'd been invited by the Cuban Psychiatric and Social Work Associations to present narrative therapy there. I refused to do so until we worked out an agreement that they would teach their visitors, 200 of us, and we would teach our hosts, 200 of them, for 3 days. And then for the 2 days that remained, we would join one another in bilingual workshops. There was an epistemology of equity. We would trade one another. The conference was called The Spirit of Community in Narrative Therapy and Cuban Social Programs. But it wasn't so much a conference, but a place where two community and healing practices met one another. On both sides, visitors and hosts, many told me it was the best conference they had ever attended, and I certainly felt the same way. At the time, Marcela, who had migrated from Colombia to the United States some 10 years before amidst a 50-year-long civil war, was enrolled in a PhD program in family therapy at Nova Southeastern University in Florida. She was studying narrative therapy in her PhD program, of course in English, and now was a teaching assistant, once again, of course in English. She was particularly looking forward to attending a workshop on narrative therapy presented by Marta Campillo, a professor at a Mexican university, and this would be the first one she had ever attended in Spanish, her mother tongue. Afterwards, I accidentally came up behind her and overheard her telling Marta with considerable shame that she had been unable to understand a word of narrative therapy in Spanish, and that somehow or other she felt she had betrayed her mother tongue that had been passed down to her by her mother, father, family, community, culture, and country. She was wondering how this had come about when she realized I had, quite unintentionally, overheard her. She blushed with mortification. Somehow or other, we both then pretended as if nothing had happened and quickly changed the subject to an unrelated matter. However, I could not get this matter out of my mind. I had no idea you could know narrative therapy in your second language, but find it unintelligible when translated into your mother tongue. Although I was an ignorant monolingual, luckily, I was reminded of my revelation from when I was 17, that each language had a mind of its own. I had a sleepless night pondering this. The next day, I enthusiastically approached Marcela with a tentative proposal for a topic for her doctoral thesis. I suggested that, quotes, given that you know narrative therapy in English but not in Spanish, would you consider that your English-speaking Marcela might watch as your Spanish-speaking Marcela learns narrative therapy and write this up? She was intrigued by such a prospect and decided to do so by translating Michael's 2007 Maps of Narrative Practice into Spanish. You might have thought that for a bilingual with postgraduate degrees from both Colombia and the United States that this would have been a very easy PhD. Not so. In fact, it turned out to be a 581-page thesis, as Marcela, without intending to do so, ended up writing 3 intimately linked versions within it. When Michael White learned that she intended to translate maps while she was studying with him in Adelaide in 2008, he asked her out to dinner to discuss this. Marcela recalls asking Michael, "What are your hopes for my translation of maps into Spanish?" She recalls his reply as, "My only hope is that the spirit of the practice remains." Marcela then went on to ask him his opinion of whether she should use the familiar or formal terms of address, and he looked at her kindly saying, "This is something only you can decide. I am not a Spanish speaker, nor know nothing of your culture and politics." Marcela admitted to me recently that she felt embarrassed by this query. However, this emboldened her to proceed with considerable zeal in 18-hour-long study days, which, believe it or not, she told me were some of the best times of her life. She speaks of her first attempt in the following ways, and I'm quoting from her. "I was doing a domesticating translation, which was literal. concern for fidelity, and to remain pure to Michael's original text. I consumed maps like a McDonald's burger. I was dismayed to realize that I was engaged in the whitening of my identity without any reference to the geopolitics of knowledge and political disparities. I am a mestiza woman, Spanish, African, the indigenous Muisca, and Jewish blood runs in my veins. Should I deny this to myself and my readers? Had I inadvertently colonized myself? Let me briefly introduce you to translation theory and the two basic translation strategies it proposes. One is called domestication and the other foreignization. Since the 1970s, these strategies have been engaged in a fierce cultural and political dispute rather than a linguistic one. A domesticating translation means erasing and then replacing the language being translated by the language that does the translation, what Marcella came to refer to as a colonizing translation. A foreignizing translation preserves the difference of the language under translation and requires the reader to go abroad, what Marcella called a decolonizing translation. Lawrence Venuti is the foremost advocate of translation by foreignization, believing there is what he refers to as, quotes, violence residing in the very purpose and activity of a domesticating translation. He holds that domestication involves, quote, an ethnocentric reduction of the foreign text to Anglo-American cultural values. On the other hand, he strongly argues that foreignization can be expected to, quote, resist ethnocentrism and racism, cultural narcissism, and imperialism. Marcella then turned to a foreignizing translation. This is how she describes her second version of maps. The politics and ethics of narrative therapy were so familiar to me when I first learned about it, it went right to my heart. I now decided that I should retain the integrity of its practice, but not be colonized by it. I retranslated maps in terms of my country, culture, and language. I did so by turning to the literatures and stories of Colombia and Latin America and its social and political histories. For some time, I put narrative therapy knowledge on hold and then returned to it later. I searched for Latin American sources that resembled the sources that Michael and David had sought out, and without much difficulty found them. My third translation was what Clive Scott refers to as a co-authoring translation, and what I have come to call fair trade. I have a utopian vision of narrative therapy in Latin America, where the knowledges and histories implicit in Spanish and English meet at the border between them, and where both are considered to have legitimate contributions to make, where there is an epistemology of equity. Here, a fair encounter takes place in which the authority of each is challenged and something new can come about, though familiar to both. How does Marcella intend to go about this? I will have more to say about that before the end of my address. Before I do, I wanted to quote from Travis Heath, a colleague in Denver, Colorado, about a meeting we had in 2015. My travels with Marcella Polenko and that meeting with Travis made me wish to address you here today. There had been a lot of buzz at conferences in Adelaide and Vancouver about this very robust, charismatic brown guy in his early 30s with dreadlocks, whose presentations were thrilling those who attended them. When I realized I might hear him speak in the 2015 conference in Vancouver, I jumped at the opportunity to attend. He spoke about Ray, a 24-year-old African-American man on probation for a crime of violence. Ray had told him, quotes, "There are a lot of people in the world who don't have a voice. And by voice I mean, you know, we all have a voice box that works. What I mean when I say voice is a voice that others can hear and really listen to. My whole life I've never really had that voice because I am poor and black, except when I rap. This is true, you know, for the whole crew in my neighborhood too. Rap is our voice." This is how Travis told a recent audience at a workshop Marcella, Travis, and I gave in his hometown of Denver. I'm quoting Travis here. Just then, I looked to my right to see the eyes of my colleague and co-presenter, Paulo Arroyo. It was as if he had seen a UFO, an unidentified flying object. He nodded his head to the left, indicating that I moved my glance in that direction. As I looked into the row, there was David Epston, just getting comfortable in his seat. I had the reaction that any seasoned presenter would have, oh shit. While my presentation was about the work Paulo and I had been doing with hip-hop and rap music with young African-American and Latino men on probation, the first 30 minutes was a history lesson for those who might not be very familiar with narrative therapy. I made a quick calculation in my head and determined that I was prepared to reference David and/or Michael White's work directly at least 8 times. Usually when you are presenting the history of a therapeutic approach, the co-founder isn't sitting in the second row. Oh dear. Given that the proceedings were about to begin, I bit my lip, put both feet firmly on the ground, and pushed off into the great abyss. Within the first 10 minutes of the presentation, I sneaked a look or 10 at David, trying to gauge what he might be thinking. I saw him smile and nod. That was enough for me. At least I hadn't made a fool of myself, or if I did, he wasn't going to let anyone know about it. Paulo and I made it to the end of the presentation. I exhaled deeply with a sense of relief due to the fact that it was over. I quickly made my way to the exit. Later that night, all of the conference presenters were invited to meet together over dinner. As I was standing and talking to Paulo, David approached us. Uh-oh, the moment of truth. I pondered finding a way to make my exit, but it was blocked on all sides. I enjoyed learning about your work, David said. Really well done. Would it be all right if I asked you just one question? I nodded my assent. Why are you asking Australian and New Zealand questions? A little bit confused, my face begged for a more in-depth explanation. What if you let hip-hop ask the questions, David queried. Just then it hit me what was transpiring. Here was the person who helped create this thing called narrative therapy, and he was inviting me to do things not the way he had done them, but rather the way that best fit the work Paulo and I were doing. Still a bit stunned by this question, David followed up, would you like my permission for you to rap? I looked at Paulo and we nodded affirmatively in action. Well, you have my permission, he said with a warm smile. It's a smile I'll remember for a very long time. Why had Travis erased his own culture, language, and replaced it with a version that you might expect in Adelaide or Auckland? Had narrative therapy against its will and unwittingly become a colonizer of others? Perhaps it had, despite its best intentions. So let me tell you how Marcella and I went about foreignizing Michael's maps in the first instance, and then establishing the grounds for fair trade. We hit upon a fanciful notion to assist us here. I suspect there are other ways, but this served our purposes wonderfully well. We imagined something that was contrary to fact. As you well know, narrative therapy was born and bred in Australia and New Zealand, and within Anglo-American culture at large. We set off together on our travels in Latin American literature, politics, and culture by imagining that narrative therapy was in fact born and bred in Latin America. And if this was so, we asked ourselves, what would have been its Latin American sources? And we then began, like explorers traveling upriver, against the river's flow, perhaps hundreds of miles inland, until we found its source or sources. We would trace every aspect of narrative therapy that seemed distinctive to either or both of us and find a Latin American source. And as Marcella mentioned, this was far easier to do than either of us had expected. I was encouraged to rethink my New Zealand narrative therapy, while Marcella was required to think her United States-informed narrative therapy. In some ways, we ended up with more narrative therapies than we so far know what to do with. But let me tell you how wonderful it is to revel in variant versions of something you've come to love and the creativity that comes to play here. Like Marcella, those of you who have no particular allegiance to Anglo-American English and culture, let me remind you of some of narrative therapy's longest-standing commitments. First and foremost, it has never thought any sort of professional monopoly or over-knowledge or global or universal truth for which it can claim ownership. In fact, I argue that the reverse is the case. It has retained a humility and concentrated its efforts in what Foucault called, quotes, the returns of knowledge. Narrative therapy acknowledges local knowledges, and in fact, one of the practices that I am proudest of is, and perhaps requires the greatest skill, is that which elevates the knowing of the other, rather than elevating professional knowledges. It is narrative therapy that considers what it refers to as insider knowledges as equivalent to outsider or professional knowledges. Michael and I took up where the French philosopher Michel Foucault left off when he referred to, quotes, the insurrection of subjugated knowledges. He says, when I say subjugated knowledges, I am referring to a whole series of knowledges that have been disqualified as non-conceptual knowledges, as insufficiently elaborated knowledges, naive knowledges, hierarchically inferior knowledges that are below the required level of erudition or scientificity, the scientific. And it is thanks to the reappearance of these knowledges from below, a knowledge that is local, regional, differential, incapable of unanimity, in which derives power solely from the fact that is different from the knowledge that surrounds us. It is the reappearance of what people know at a local level of these disqualified knowledges that make critique possible. At some point, you may have to go away as far as you must. Please return as far as you can, and we will meet you there. What Marcella refers to as the borderlands, where neither language nor culture reigns over the other. It is between languages where the play of creativity resides. It is here that what David Denbrough has referred to as intercultural invention will take place. Marcella and I believe that such encounters of fair trade in these borderlands will be one of the ways narrative therapy will be reimagined. In such a reimagination, would we in any way reinvent narrative therapy as you take it home to your culture and language, and I bring it back home in English to New Zealand and Australia? I thank you for giving me this opportunity to address you, and I hope that you have a wonderful conference. Thank you very much.